The moment a badge becomes more important than the law, justice begins to disappear. 12 hours before a stunned courtroom watched a veteran police officer quietly remove his badge for the last time, the marble halls of the James Warren Federal Courthouse in Washington, D.C. echoed with the ordinary rhythm of another weekday morning. Lawyers hurried through the entrance, balancing leather briefcases and steaming coffee cups. Deputy marshals exchanged calm greetings as sunlight poured through towering glass windows, reflecting across polished stone floors that had witnessed decades of history. Everything looked routine. Everything felt predictable. No one walking through those security doors could have imagined that before the day ended, one decision lasting less than a minute would unravel a career built over nearly 20 years. Officer Daniel Brooks believed he understood exactly what his job required. Assigned to courthouse security, he had developed a reputation for strict enforcement and unwavering confidence. He trusted procedures, trusted instincts, and above all trusted the authority represented by the uniform resting across his shoulders. To him, hesitation invited danger. Questions slowed action. Confidence kept order. That belief had earned him praise from some colleagues, criticism from others, but never enough consequences to make him reconsider how quickly he judged the people standing in front of him. Hundreds of visitors entered the courthouse every day. Most blended into the endless stream of attorneys, clerks, witnesses, and government employees. Some appeared nervous. Others looked impatient. Daniel rarely remembered their faces after they disappeared beyond the metal detectors. But this morning, one woman quietly stepped onto the courthouse steps carrying nothing more than a dark leather portfolio and a federal identification wallet. She wore a tailored navy suit without any sign of status beyond a simple silver pin on her lapel. Her pace was measured. Her expression remained calm. She greeted the security staff with a polite smile that received little attention in return. Her name was Vanessa Carter. Around the country, federal judges recognized her for her integrity, precision, and unwavering commitment to the Constitution. Yet outside those circles, she looked like any other professional arriving for another workday. There was no motorcade, no assistant announcing her arrival, no flashing lights, only quiet confidence. Imagine standing there, knowing exactly who you are while everyone around you decides they already know who you must be. Sometimes the loudest assumptions arrive in complete silence. Vanessa approached the security checkpoint without urgency and presented her federal credentials exactly as protocol required. For a brief second, everything remained perfectly ordinary. Then Daniel's eyes settled on the badge inside the open credential wallet. Something in his expression changed. His confidence hardened into suspicion. Around them, conversations continued uninterrupted. Phones rang behind the reception desk. Elevator doors opened and closed. No one realized they were watching the first move in a story that would soon travel far beyond the walls of this courthouse. Within hours, judges, federal marshals, prosecutors, and reporters would all be asking the same question. How could one moment of misplaced certainty bring an accomplished officer's career to an irreversible end? Daniel Brooks studied the identification wallet for only a second before lowering it slightly, his eyes moving from the polished federal seal to the composed expression on Vanessa Carter's face. Instead of recognizing the credential, he searched for reasons to doubt it. Years of confidence had quietly transformed into certainty, and certainty often left very little room for curiosity. Vanessa remained still, her hands relaxed around the leather portfolio she had carried up the courthouse steps. She did not raise her voice or argue. She simply waited, believing that a federal credential presented at the entrance of a federal courthouse would speak for itself. Around them, the morning crowd continued to flow through the security checkpoint. A young law clerk hurried toward an elevator while reviewing handwritten notes. Two assistant United States attorneys discussed the schedule for an afternoon hearing. A maintenance employee rolled a card across the polished floor, barely glancing toward the growing pause at the entrance. Most people assumed they were watching an ordinary security inspection. Daniel looked again at the credential before shaking his head almost imperceptibly. "Where did you get this?" he asked in a firm but controlled voice. Vanessa answered with the same calm that had followed her from the sidewalk. It was issued through the proper federal channels. Her response was simple, respectful, and entirely factual. Yet something about her composure seemed to frustrate him even more than if she had become defensive. He stepped slightly closer, studying every detail of the identification wallet as though expecting it to reveal a flaw that justified his suspicion. "Do you have another form of identification?" he asked. Without hesitation, Vanessa reached into her portfolio and presented a government-issued driver's license. Daniel compared the names twice. Everything matched. Even so, he did not appear satisfied. Imagine finding every answer you requested and still believing the answers could not possibly be true. Sometimes people stop looking for facts because they have already decided on a conclusion. A few visitors slowed their pace, sensing that something unusual was unfolding. Quiet conversations drifted through the lobby. Some exchanged curious glances before continuing toward the elevators. Others lingered just long enough to wonder why an otherwise ordinary credential check seemed to be taking so much longer than usual. Vanessa noticed the attention but refused to let it change her demeanor. Years on the federal bench had taught her that patience often revealed more about others than anger ever could. She folded her hands lightly over the portfolio and waited. Daniel radioed another officer, requesting verification of the credential number. The dispatcher acknowledged the request, but federal database responses were not always immediate. Several long seconds passed. To Daniel, the delay reinforced his doubts. To Vanessa, it was simply another reminder that procedure worked best when accompanied by fairness. She glanced toward the courtroom corridor where the morning docket would begin in less than 30 minutes. Judges valued punctuality, and she was no exception, yet she made no attempt to rush the process. She quietly understood that the next decision would define far more than the remainder of her morning. It would reveal the character of the man standing in front of her, and neither of them realized that dozens of unseen security cameras were faithfully recording every word, every gesture, and every choice made inside the silent marble lobby. The response from the communications desk did not arrive as quickly as Daniel expected, and the silence seemed to reinforce the story he had already created in his own mind. He glanced once more at the federal credential before closing the wallet and holding it at his side instead of returning it. Vanessa Carter watched him without visible frustration. Her breathing remained steady. Her posture never changed. She had spent years listening to emotional arguments inside federal courtrooms, and she understood that patience often revealed more than confrontation ever could. Still, every passing second carried a cost. In less than 20 minutes, a courtroom upstairs would begin filling with attorneys, witnesses, court staff, and members of the public waiting for a hearing that had been scheduled months in advance. The case involved questions of constitutional law, and every person expected the presiding judge to arrive precisely on time. None of them knew that she was standing only a few yards away, delayed by an encounter that should have lasted less than a minute. Daniel noticed her glance toward the elevators. "You are not going anywhere until I know exactly who you are," he said with measured confidence. Vanessa met his eyes without raising her voice. "Officer, my identification contains everything you need. I have cooperated fully." There was no anger in her words. No challenge. Only quiet certainty. For reasons Daniel could not explain, that calm confidence unsettled him. He had encountered nervous visitors, impatient attorneys, and frustrated defendants before. Those reactions made sense to him. But someone who remained completely composed while being questioned did not fit the expectation he had already formed. Imagine believing that confidence must always come from arrogance, when sometimes it comes from simply knowing the truth. Around them, the atmosphere in the lobby slowly began to change. A courthouse clerk recognized Vanessa from a distance, but hesitated before saying anything. She assumed the officer must have a legitimate reason for the delay. Two deputy marshals exiting a nearby hallway briefly noticed the conversation before continuing toward another assignment, unaware that they had seen only the beginning of a much larger story. Near the security desk, a visitor quietly stepped aside to avoid interrupting what appeared to be an official matter. Routine has a remarkable ability to disguise extraordinary moments. Daniel finally handed the credential back, but instead of ending the inspection, he asked another series of questions. "Who are you meeting today? Which courtroom are you assigned to? What is the purpose of your visit?" Vanessa answered each one directly. "I am here for this morning's hearing." "Which hearing?" "The first hearing on today's federal docket." Her answers remained truthful, but she never volunteered more information than the questions required. She understood that official identification already established her authority. It was not her responsibility to persuade someone determined not to believe it. The dispatcher spoke again through Daniel's radio, this time explaining that verification was still processing through federal channels and requesting additional patience. Daniel frowned. To him, the delay sounded suspicious. To everyone familiar with interagency systems, it sounded perfectly ordinary. Then another courthouse employee stepped into the lobby, stopped abruptly after seeing Vanessa standing at the security checkpoint, and an expression of unmistakable surprise crossed his face before he immediately turned back toward the corridor from which he had just emerged. The employee disappeared back into the corridor so quickly that Daniel barely noticed him, but someone else did. Vanessa followed the movement with quiet awareness before returning her attention to the officer standing in front of her. She understood exactly why the man had reacted that way, yet she made no effort to call him back. She had learned long ago that truth carried far more weight when it arrived on its own. Daniel interpreted the interruption differently. To him, it looked like someone avoiding an uncomfortable situation rather than recognizing an important one. His confidence hardened even further. Until verification comes back, I am treating this as an unresolved identification issue, he said. His words echoed softly across the marble lobby, drawing the attention of a few more visitors who slowed their pace without completely stopping. No one wanted to interfere with courthouse security, but more than one person sensed that something about the exchange felt unusually tense. Vanessa answered with the same measured tone she had maintained from the beginning. Officer Brooks, I have provided every document you requested. I have followed every instruction. I respectfully ask that you allow the verification process to finish before making any additional assumptions. Hearing his own last name spoken surprised Daniel for only a fraction of a second. Then he remembered that his nameplate was clearly visible on the front of his uniform. You know my name because you can read, he replied. That does not tell me anything about you. Vanessa gave a slight nod, accepting the statement without argument. The silence that followed seemed even louder than the conversation itself. Imagine standing in a room where every person is watching the same moment, yet each one is seeing a completely different story. Some saw an officer doing his job. Others saw a professional woman waiting with remarkable patience. Very few realized that the next decision would soon become the center of an official review reaching far beyond this building. The dispatcher finally spoke again through Daniel's shoulder radio. Static briefly interrupted the message before a calm voice explained that the federal credential remained active in the system, but additional confirmation was being routed through another office because of the level of access associated with the identification. The explanation was ordinary. Certain federal credentials required higher-level verification as a matter of routine. Yet Daniel focused only on the words, additional confirmation. In his mind, those words justified continuing to escalate the encounter. Vanessa recognized the procedure immediately. She had experienced similar delays before whenever secure credentials were processed through multiple federal systems. She looked toward the courthouse clock mounted above the entrance. Less than 15 minutes remained before the morning calendar was scheduled to begin. Somewhere upstairs, courtroom deputies were arranging files on the bench. Court reporters were preparing recording equipment. Attorneys were reviewing their final notes, expecting the presiding judge to enter promptly at the appointed hour. Downstairs, however, time seemed almost suspended. Then the elevator doors opened at the far end of the lobby. A senior deputy marshal stepped out carrying a stack of case folders. He looked toward the security checkpoint, froze almost instantly after recognizing Vanessa, and his expression shifted from routine concentration to unmistakable disbelief. Instead of continuing down the hallway, he immediately reached for the secure radio attached to his shoulder and spoke in a voice so quiet that no one except those closest to him could hear a single word. The senior deputy marshal lowered his voice as he spoke into the secure radio, but urgency could not be hidden behind quiet words. Within seconds, another voice answered, followed by a brief pause that seemed to stretch across the entire lobby. Daniel noticed the exchange from the corner of his eye. Is there a problem? He called across the room. The deputy marshal looked back, forcing a polite expression before answering. I am just confirming something upstairs. It was technically true, but it was far from the whole story. Vanessa remained exactly where she had been standing, her portfolio resting comfortably against her side. She neither interrupted nor attempted to explain who she was. Years of public service had taught her that respect for procedure mattered most when procedure became inconvenient. The easiest moment to abandon professionalism was often the moment it mattered most. Another minute passed. The courthouse clock continued its steady movement toward the hour. Somewhere above them, courtroom deputies adjusted microphones, arranged case files, and checked seating assignments for the attorneys expected to arrive at any moment. A judicial assistant glanced toward the empty hallway leading to the judge's chambers and quietly wondered why the morning routine had not yet begun. Back in the lobby, Daniel folded his arms. "You seem remarkably calm," he observed. Vanessa offered a faint smile. "Experience teaches patience." "Experience doing what?" he asked. She answered without hesitation. "Serving the public." Every word she spoke was completely truthful, yet Daniel heard only what he expected to hear. He interpreted her confidence as evasiveness instead of professionalism. Imagine how differently two people can hear the exact same sentence when one is listening for facts and the other is listening for confirmation of an assumption. Nearby, a young attorney who had entered through another security lane quietly recognized Vanessa from a legal conference several years earlier. He looked from her to Daniel, uncertain whether he should intervene. Before he could decide, another courthouse employee gently touched his arm and whispered, "Do not interrupt. Someone important has already been notified." Those words never reached Daniel. They remained part of the quiet current of conversations beginning to spread through the building. One by one, courthouse staff became aware that an unexpected delay was unfolding at the entrance. Not because anyone announced it, but because experienced professionals understood that certain people were never late without a reason. Daniel's radio crackled again. This time the dispatcher sounded more deliberate. "Officer Brooks, verification remains in progress. Please maintain the individual at the checkpoint. Supervisory personnel have been notified and are responding." The message was intended to preserve order until senior officials arrived. Daniel interpreted it as support for his own judgment. He nodded confidently and clipped the radio back onto his shoulder. Vanessa simply acknowledged the update with a courteous nod of her own. She looked once more toward the elevators, then back at Daniel. "Officer Brooks," she said gently, "before the next few minutes unfold, I hope you remember that every public servant represents more than a title. We represent the public's trust." Daniel answered with quiet certainty. "That is exactly what I am protecting." Neither of them realized that the elevator at the far end of the lobby had already begun its descent, carrying the very people whose arrival would transform an ordinary courthouse morning into a moment that no one present would ever forget. The soft chime announced the elevator's arrival before its doors slowly opened onto the lobby. Conversation faded almost instinctively as several senior officials stepped out together. At the front was Chief Marshal Robert Hayes, a man whose calm presence usually settled even the busiest mornings inside the courthouse. Beside him walked Deputy Marshal Olivia Reed, carrying a tablet filled with the day's judicial schedule. Neither appeared hurried, yet every step carried unmistakable purpose. Daniel noticed the group approaching and straightened his posture, convinced they had arrived to support the security process already underway. He gave a respectful nod. "Chief Marshal, I am in the middle of verifying an identification issue." Robert Hayes did not answer immediately. Instead, his eyes moved past Daniel and settled on Vanessa Carter. For a brief moment, the entire lobby seemed to stand perfectly still. Then, without hesitation, the Chief Marshal offered a courteous nod that reflected years of professional respect. "Good morning, Judge Carter," he said warmly. "We have been wondering why you had not reached chambers." The words landed with the weight of absolute certainty. Every nearby conversation stopped. The courthouse clerk who had quietly watched from across the lobby lowered the file she had been carrying. The young attorney who had recognized Vanessa earlier slowly exhaled. Even the maintenance employee paused beside his cart, sensing that history had quietly changed direction in front of him. Daniel remained motionless. He looked first at Robert Hayes, then at Vanessa, searching for some indication that he had misunderstood what he had just heard. "Judge," he repeated almost under his breath. Olivia Reed stepped forward and opened the digital schedule on her tablet. "The Honorable Vanessa Carter is presiding over the first hearing this morning in Courtroom 3, she said calmly. The courtroom has been waiting for her arrival. No one raised a voice. No one displayed anger. The truth needed no dramatic introduction because the facts spoke clearly enough on their own. Imagine spending an entire morning believing you were evaluating someone else's authority, only to discover that the person standing quietly before you had never needed to prove it in the first place. Genuine authority rarely announces itself. It simply exists. Daniel felt every confident assumption from the past 20 minutes begin to dissolve beneath the reality now standing before him. He looked toward the federal credential once more, realizing that every document had been authentic from the beginning. The verification delay had never suggested doubt. It reflected the higher-level security associated with a sitting federal judge. Robert Hayes accepted the credential wallet from Daniel with measured professionalism and returned it to Vanessa. "Judge Carter," he said, "I sincerely apologize for the delay to your morning." Vanessa accepted the credential with the same composure she had shown since arriving at the courthouse. "Thank you, Chief Marshal," she replied. "I appreciate everyone's commitment to courthouse security. I also believe every interaction deserves fairness, patience, and respect." Her words carried no bitterness. There was no public accusation and no demand for immediate consequences. That quiet restraint seemed to affect the room even more deeply than anger could have. Daniel stood silently as the full meaning of the moment settled around him. The issue before him was no longer a routine security check. It had become a question of judgment, professionalism, and public trust. And although the morning hearing was about to begin upstairs, another far more personal reckoning had only just begun. Judge Vanessa Carter thanked Chief Marshal Robert Hayes with a quiet nod before continuing toward the private elevator that led to the judicial chambers. As she walked away, no one heard a single word of complaint from her. She did not demand an apology from Officer Daniel Brooks. She did not ask for anyone to be removed from duty. She simply continued with the responsibility that had brought her to the courthouse that morning. That decision left an even deeper impression on everyone who had witnessed the exchange. Professionalism had answered assumption without raising its voice. Daniel remained near the security checkpoint as the lobby gradually returned to its usual rhythm, but nothing around him felt ordinary anymore. The same marble floors, the same courthouse walls, and the same steady flow of visitors now seemed strangely unfamiliar. Every confident conclusion he had reached during the previous half hour replayed in his mind with uncomfortable clarity. Within minutes, an official notification arrived from courthouse administration requesting that Daniel report to a conference room immediately after his shift concluded. The message contained no accusations and no conclusions. It simply informed him that the morning incident would require formal review under established departmental procedures. Across the building, the first hearing of the day began almost exactly on schedule. Judge Carter entered the courtroom with the same calm expression she had carried through the entire encounter downstairs. Attorneys stood as she took the bench. The courtroom deputy announced the session, and the work of the court proceeded without interruption. Anyone entering the room for the first time would never have guessed that only a short time earlier the presiding judge had experienced an unexpected delay at the entrance. She focused completely on the law before her, refusing to allow the morning's events to influence the fairness expected from every federal judge. Imagine carrying personal disappointment into a courtroom and choosing to leave it outside the door because justice belongs to everyone equally. That kind of discipline cannot be written into policy manuals. It is built through character over many years. Meanwhile, the review process quietly began. Security supervisors requested copies of surveillance footage from every camera covering the courthouse entrance. Radio communications from the dispatch center were preserved. Electronic access records confirmed the exact time Vanessa's credential had been presented and the exact sequence of verification messages received by dispatch. Witnesses were politely asked to provide factual accounts of what they had observed, without speculation or personal opinion. Every step followed standard procedure because public trust depended upon careful, objective review rather than emotional reaction. Daniel sat alone during his lunch break, replaying conversations he had barely noticed while they were happening. He remembered Vanessa's patience, her respectful answers, and the warning she had offered moments before the chief marshal arrived. She had not threatened him. She had simply hoped he would remember that every public servant represented the trust of the people. Those words now echoed far more loudly than any criticism could have. By late afternoon, The evidence had begun forming a complete picture, not of a single dramatic moment, but of a series of decisions shaped by assumptions instead of verified facts. The investigation was no longer asking whether procedures had been followed. It had begun asking a far more difficult question. What happens when confidence replaces impartial judgment inside an institution built upon fairness for every citizen who walks through its doors? Over the following days, the review continued with the quiet precision expected inside the federal justice system. Every piece of information was examined in chronological order. Security camera recordings were synchronized with radio communications. Electronic access logs confirmed the exact minute each credential had been scanned. Witness statements were compared against recorded footage instead of personal opinion. The purpose was never to embarrass anyone. It was to establish an accurate record of what had happened and why. Daniel Brooks attended each meeting as required. For the first time in many years, he found himself answering questions instead of asking them. Supervisors did not accuse him of acting with bad intentions. Instead, they asked him to explain the reasoning behind each decision. Why had he continued questioning after valid credentials had been presented? Why had he interpreted routine verification delays as evidence against the visitor? Why had he continued relying on assumptions after receiving information that should have encouraged greater patience? None of the questions were raised with anger. Each one reflected a single principle that governed public service. Decisions must be supported by facts, not impressions. Daniel realized that every answer he offered led back to the same uncomfortable conclusion. He had become too certain of his own judgment before the evidence had been fully established. Imagine discovering that the greatest mistake of your career did not begin with one dramatic decision, but with a series of small assumptions that seemed reasonable until they were tested against the truth. That realization is often more difficult than any formal consequence. Judge Vanessa Carter was informed that the review was progressing according to established policy. She was asked whether she wished to submit additional comments regarding the incident. After reading the preliminary report, she responded with a brief written statement. She expressed confidence in the review process, thanked the staff members who had handled the situation professionally after her identity was confirmed, and emphasized that accountability should focus on improving public trust rather than seeking personal vindication. Her response surprised several officials who had expected a far stronger reaction. Chief Marshal Robert Hayes later remarked during an internal meeting that leadership was often measured most clearly during moments of disappointment. The discussion soon shifted beyond one encounter at a courthouse entrance. Training supervisors reviewed existing guidance concerning implicit assumptions, professional communication, and respectful interactions with every visitor regardless of appearance, occupation, or background. The incident became an opportunity to examine whether procedures alone were enough without the discipline to apply them fairly. Public confidence depended upon both. Late one afternoon, Daniel received formal notice that the review panel had completed its findings and that a final administrative meeting had been scheduled for the following morning. He folded the letter carefully before placing it inside his desk drawer. The courthouse outside his office window looked exactly as it always had. Attorneys continued arriving for hearings. Families entered hoping for justice. Employees carried out responsibilities that affected lives every day. Yet Daniel understood that when he walked into the conference room the next morning, the conversation would no longer be about a single delayed arrival. It would be about whether the judgment expected from someone entrusted with public authority had matched the responsibility that came with wearing the badge. The following morning arrived with the same quiet dignity that defined every day inside the federal courthouse. Yet for Daniel Brooks, it carried a weight unlike any he had experienced before. He entered the administrative conference room, wearing the same uniform that had once filled him with unquestioned confidence. Around the table sat Chief Marshal Robert Hayes, two senior supervisory officials, a representative from Human Resources, and an attorney assigned to ensure that departmental policy was followed correctly. A neatly organized folder rested in front of each person. Inside those folders were surveillance images, communication transcripts, witness statements, and the complete timeline of the incident. Robert Hayes began the meeting without accusation. Officer Brooks, this review is about preserving the integrity of public service. We are here to examine actions, not personal worth. Daniel listened silently. Every document presented confirmed the same conclusion. Judge Vanessa Carter had cooperated fully from the first moment of contact. Her credentials had been authentic. The verification delay had been routine for a federal judicial credential with enhanced security protections. At every stage, opportunities had existed to pause, reassess, and allow the facts to guide the interaction. Instead, certainty had gradually replaced objectivity. Daniel finally spoke. "I believed I was protecting the courthouse." Robert Hayes nodded respectfully. Protecting the courthouse also means protecting the dignity of every person who enters it. Those responsibilities cannot be separated. The room remained quiet after those words. No one celebrated the outcome that was about to follow because accountability was never intended to be entertainment. It was intended to restore trust. After reviewing the panel's unanimous findings, the final administrative decision was delivered. Daniel's conduct had fallen below the professional standards required for his position. His employment with courthouse security would be terminated effective immediately. The decision reflected not a single mistake, but a pattern of judgment that had failed to meet the obligations entrusted to someone wearing the badge. Daniel accepted the written decision with steady hands, though the silence surrounding him felt heavier than any argument could have been. As he left the conference room, he passed through the same lobby where everything had begun only days earlier. Visitors continued arriving for hearings. Families waited patiently on wooden benches. Attorneys hurried toward courtrooms carrying briefcases filled with legal documents. The building itself had not changed. Only one man's understanding of responsibility had. Later that afternoon, Judge Vanessa Carter received formal notice that the administrative process had concluded. She read the brief memorandum, closed the folder, and returned to preparing for the next day's docket. She did not ask for further action, public recognition, or personal acknowledgement. For her, the most meaningful outcome was not that someone had lost a position. It was that the institution had demonstrated its willingness to examine itself honestly when fairness had been questioned. Imagine living in a society where justice is measured not by how loudly authority speaks, but by how faithfully it corrects itself when it falls short. That is the quiet strength that keeps public trust alive. Long after the courthouse lights dimmed that evening, people who had witnessed the encounter continued to remember one image above all others. They remembered a woman who never raised her voice because she understood that truth did not need volume to be heard. They remembered an institution willing to place principle above pride. And they remembered that a badge may represent authority, but character is what determines whether that authority earns respect. On that morning, one career came to an end, but something far more important endured. Justice had not arrived through anger. It had arrived through patience, truth, accountability, and the unwavering belief that every person deserves to be treated with equal dignity before the law.